I didn't raise my voice. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even ask the question that burned in my chest for years. I just watched as a quiet request turned into pressure, and pressure turned into something no one in my family wanted to name. It started with $250, 000, a number spoken softly, wrapped in words like family trust and temporary help. And then, without an argument or a goodbye, my grandfather disappeared to Florida. No celebration, no postcards, just distance and silence. For a long time, everyone pretended nothing was wrong, that this was normal, that money doesn't change people, that elders don't feel fear. But silence has a weight, and when you carry it long enough, it begins to leave marks. This isn't a story about shouting or revenge. It's about what happens when power hides behind family, and justice arrives slowly, quietly, when no one expects it anymore. Before we continue, I'd like to know who's listening. Please leave a comment with your location and local time. I read every single one. And if stories about quiet endurance and delayed justice speak to you, consider subscribing. You're not alone here. I used to believe my family was stable in the quiet, unquestioned way people in the Midwest often mistake for strength. We lived just outside Columbus, Ohio, in a neighborhood where lawns were trimmed on Saturdays and problems were handled behind closed doors. Nothing dramatic ever happened, or at least nothing people talked about. My father, Richard, was the center of that calm. He was 58 when this story began, tall, composed, always dressed as if a client meeting might happen at any moment. For more than 2 decades, he worked in commercial real estate leases, acquisitions, long-term investments. He spoke in numbers and projections the way other people spoke in feelings. When he talked, people listened. When he decided, things moved. In our family, his word carried weight without him ever needing to demand it. My grandfather, Harold, was the opposite in almost every visible way. He was 81, then retired from a manufacturing plant where he'd worked since his early 20s. His life had been built on repetition and reliability, early mornings, packed lunches, overtime shifts when they were offered. He lived alone in the same modest, one-story house he'd bought decades earlier, 15 miles from us in a quieter part of town. The porch sagged slightly, the paint peeled near the windows. Inside, everything stayed exactly where it had been for years. Grandpa didn't talk much. He never had. He listened, nodded, and let other people fill the space. I grew up thinking that was humility. Now I think it was survival. I was 32 at the time, single, working in operations for a regional logistics company. My job was steady but invisible. I made enough to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and the occasional emergency, but nothing more. I wasn't consulted on financial matters. I wasn't expected to be. In our family, authority didn't come from age or experience. It came from confidence and control, and that belonged to my father. Family gatherings followed patterns that never changed. Thanksgiving was always at my parents' house. Christmas Eve was Grandpa's responsibility, though my father usually reorganized things without asking. He'd decide where people sat, what time we ate when dessert was served. Grandpa never objected. If anything, he seemed relieved not to decide. I didn't notice how that looked until much later. The first time I remember money entering the conversation in a serious way, it felt almost casual. My father mentioned it over dinner one night between comments about interest rates and a news segment playing quietly in the background. He talked about how unpredictable markets had become, how important it was to protect family assets. Grandpa sat across from him, hands folded, listening. I remember watching Grandpa's eyes move, not to my father's face, but to the table, to the grain of the wood, to the small scratch near his coffee mug. Dad spoke calmly, confidently. He didn't ask a question. He explained a situation. He used phrases like temporary reallocation and short-term liquidity. The words were smooth, professional. Grandpa nodded once or twice, but his mouth stayed tight the way it did when he was thinking hard about something he didn't want to say out loud. I sat quietly, pretending not to pay attention because that's what I always did when things felt uncomfortable. I told myself it was none of my business, that my father knew what he was doing, that Grandpa was an adult who could speak up if he wanted to. After that night, the conversations didn't stop. They simply moved out of my hearing. My father started visiting Grandpa more often, usually during the week. He'd say he was helping organize documents or checking on a few things. It sounded responsible, even kind. That's how everyone treated it. But Grandpa's behavior changed. He started answering the phone less. When I did reach him, his responses were shorter than usual. If I asked how he was feeling, he'd say, "I'm all right." If I asked what he'd been up to, he'd say, "Nothing much." When I mentioned Dad's visits, Grandpa would pause just a second too long before saying, "He's taking care of some things." I began to notice how carefully he spoke, as if every sentence was being weighed before it left his mouth. My father, meanwhile, seemed energized. He talked more openly about plans, about restructuring finances, about making sure Grandpa wouldn't have to worry anymore. He framed everything as a solution, as relief, as something Grandpa should be grateful for. He never once described it as a choice. There were moments that should have stopped me. One afternoon I stopped by Grandpa's house unannounced and found him sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread in front of him. He looked up too quickly, startled, and instinctively pulled the papers closer to himself. When I asked what they were, he said, "Just some things your dad's helping me sort through." His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he gathered the documents and slid them into a folder. Another time I noticed Grandpa struggling to stand from his chair after dinner. My father reached out not to help him up but to move the chair back so it wouldn't scrape the floor. Grandpa waved him off and stood on his own jaw, clenched pride intact. My father didn't notice, or didn't care. I started to see how little space Grandpa truly had in his own life. Still, I said nothing. Silence had always been my default. I told myself I lacked proof, that I didn't want to create problems where there were none, that families handled their own business. In reality, I was afraid of being wrong, afraid of confronting my father, afraid of what might happen if I spoke and no one listened. Sometimes Grandpa would look at me across the room, his expression unreadable. In those moments I felt like he was deciding whether to trust me with something heavy. Every time he chose not to. And every time I let that decision stand, I thought silence was neutral. I didn't yet understand that silence always takes a side. By the time Grandpa began to withdraw, not just emotionally but physically, I sensed something had already been decided without him truly agreeing to it. The house I had believed was solid hadn't collapsed. It hadn't even cracked visibly. But the foundation was shifting slowly, quietly under the weight of money and unspoken pressure. And none of us had found the courage to stop it. The number didn't appear all at once. It arrived in pieces, spread across conversations that were never meant to feel heavy. At first, my father talked about bridging a gap. Then it became unlocking capital. Eventually, the figure settled into the air between us like something solid and undeniable. $250,000. He never said it dramatically. There was no pause before or after. It was spoken the same way he might mention square footage or annual yield. To him, it was a calculation. To Grandpa, it was everything he had spent a lifetime protecting. I remember the afternoon it became clear that this wasn't a suggestion. We were sitting in Grandpa's living room. The curtains were half drawn, letting in muted afternoon light. My father sat forward on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, papers neatly stacked on the coffee table in front of him. Grandpa sat in his armchair back straight, hands folded together as if bracing himself. I stayed quiet, perched on the far end of the couch, already sensing I wasn't meant to be there. Dad spoke in the same calm tone he always used when he wanted something to sound reasonable. He explained that the money wasn't a gift. It was temporary, a short-term move that would be returned once a deal closed. He talked about timelines, safeguards, how everything would be documented properly. Grandpa listened. He didn't interrupt. When Dad finished, there was a long silence. "That's most of what I've got," Grandpa finally said. His voice wasn't accusatory. It wasn't emotional. It was factual, like stating the weather. Dad nodded as if he'd expected that response. "I know," he said, "but that's exactly why it makes sense. It's just sitting there right now." Grandpa shifted in his chair. "It's sitting there because I'm retired," he said quietly. "Because I don't have another income." Dad smiled slightly the way he did when he believed he was guiding someone toward the right conclusion. "You won't need to worry about income anymore," he said. "This would actually make things easier for you in the long run." Something tightened in my chest then. Grandpa's eyes flicked toward me for just a moment, then back to my father. "I don't like taking risks at my age," Grandpa said. Dad leaned back, crossing his arms. "This isn't a risk," he replied. "It's family." That word landed heavily in the room. From that point on, the conversations changed. The tone stayed polite, but the message hardened. My father stopped asking whether Grandpa was comfortable and started explaining why discomfort was unnecessary. He framed hesitation as fear, and fear as something that needed to be corrected. He visited more frequently, sometimes daily. He brought updated paperwork, revised projections. He reassured Grandpa that lawyers were involved, that everything was standard. He reminded him of all the times he had helped him over the years, driving him to appointments, handling repairs, managing finances when things got complicated. None of it was false. But the way it was assembled felt like a ledger, not a memory. I noticed Grandpa growing smaller in those moments. Not physically, but emotionally. He spoke less, asked fewer questions. When he did speak, he often prefaced it with, "I might be wrong, but," as if already preparing to concede. Once, when Dad stepped out to take a call, Grandpa leaned toward me and lowered his voice. "Your father's very confident," he said. I nodded, unsure what to say. "He always has been," Grandpa continued. I don't want to be a burden." The word burden sat between us heavy and final. I wanted to tell him he wasn't one, that he didn't owe anyone anything, that he could say no. But the words stayed lodged in my throat. I was still trapped in the belief that this wasn't my place, that stepping in would only make things worse. By the time the paperwork appeared for signing, the decision already felt made. Dad laid everything out neatly on the table. There were signature lines, dates, and explanations written in language that sounded official but vague. Grandpa read slowly, his finger tracing the lines. Dad stood nearby, answering questions quickly, confidently. "This just formalizes it," Dad said. "It protects both of us." Grandpa hesitated at the pen. His hand hovered above the paper longer than I expected. For a moment, I thought he might refuse. Then Dad spoke again. "If you don't feel comfortable," he said, "I'll have to find another way. But I was hoping we could keep this in the family." The implication was clear. Saying no would mean failure, disappointment, possibly isolation. Grandpa signed. I watched the ink sink into the paper and felt something irreversible happen in that moment. The transaction was framed as help, as trust, as responsibility. But what I saw was a man giving up control because he didn't feel allowed to keep it. After that, things moved quickly. The money transferred. Dad stopped visiting as often. He seemed satisfied, lighter somehow. Grandpa, on the other hand, became quieter than ever. He stopped inviting people over. He stopped attending some family gatherings altogether. When I asked him how he was feeling about everything, he smiled thinly and said, "It's taken care of." But it didn't feel taken care of. It felt settled in the way dust settles on things no one wants to look at. I began to notice small changes. Grandpa double-checking expenses that had never worried him before. Grandpa hesitating at the grocery store. Grandpa mentioning Florida more often, usually in passing as if testing the idea out loud. "Warmer down there," he'd say. "Might be good for my joints." I didn't connect it then. I didn't understand that the money wasn't just gone, it had taken something else with it. Safety, autonomy, the quiet assurance Grandpa had carried his entire life. The $250,000 had been positioned as temporary, as harmless, as family business. But the cost was already becoming clear, and the distance it created hadn't even begun to show yet. Once the money was gone, the pressure didn't disappear. It changed shape. At first, I expected things to settle. I assumed the tension would ease now that my father had what he wanted. That Grandpa would relax, that life would return to its quiet routines. But instead of relief, there was a new kind of weight, heavier because it was invisible. My father stopped discussing details altogether. When the $250,000 came up, he spoke as if it were already resolved, no longer open to conversation. He used phrases like, "It's handled, and there's no need to revisit it." Any attempt to ask questions was met with polite dismissal, not anger, not defensiveness, just finality. Grandpa, on the other hand, seemed to shrink under that finality. He started apologizing for things he'd never apologized for before, for calling too late, for forgetting to return a voicemail, for asking me to pick up groceries when his knee was acting up. Each apology felt unnecessary, but together they painted a picture I didn't want to see of a man who felt he had lost the right to take up space. My father's visits became less frequent but more deliberate. When he did come by, he carried himself differently, more relaxed, more authoritative. He spoke to Grandpa the way people speak to someone who has already agreed, someone who just needs to be kept on track. "I'll take care of that," Dad would say, even when Grandpa hadn't asked. "You don't need to worry about that anymore. I've already made arrangements." Each sentence removed another small piece of Grandpa's independence. I remember one evening in particular. I had stopped by Grandpa's house after work. The sun was already low, casting long shadows across the living room. Grandpa was sitting in his armchair, staring at the television without really watching it. When I asked how he was doing, he hesitated before answering. "I might need to ask your father about something," he said slowly. "What about?" I asked. He shook his head. "It's probably nothing." That was new. Grandpa had never filtered himself like that before. He had always been careful, yes, but not hesitant to speak. Now even simple decisions seemed to require approval. The pressure wasn't loud. That was the most unsettling part. There were no raised voices, no arguments, no ultimatums. Just an unspoken expectation that Grandpa would fall in line with decisions that had already been made for him. My father framed everything as concern. He reminded Grandpa of his age, of his health, of how complicated finances could become if left unmanaged. He spoke about protecting him from stress, from mistakes, from the burden of decision-making. "You've earned the right not to worry anymore," Dad said, once his tone gentle. But Grandpa didn't look relieved. He looked cornered. I began to notice how often Dad mentioned what's best, without ever asking what Grandpa wanted. If Grandpa suggested something different, keeping a small account separate, delaying a decision, reviewing paperwork again, Dad would respond with patience that bordered on condescension. "That's not necessary," he'd say. "I've already thought it through." And Grandpa would nod, retreating into silence. I felt complicit just by being there, by listening and not intervening. Every time I considered speaking up, I replayed the same doubts in my head. What if I misunderstood? What if I made things worse? What if Grandpa didn't want my help? But the truth was harder to admit. I was afraid of confronting my father, afraid of challenging the structure that had defined our family for decades, afraid of becoming the problem. The first time Grandpa mentioned Florida seriously, it caught me off guard. "I've been thinking about spending some time down south," he said one afternoon, staring out the window. "Like a vacation?" I asked. "Maybe," he replied. "Or longer." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. There was something in his voice, a tiredness I hadn't heard before. Not physical exhaustion, but emotional fatigue. The kind that comes from feeling trapped without knowing how to escape. When I mentioned it to my father later, he dismissed it immediately. "He's just restless," Dad said. "Happens at that age." But Grandpa wasn't restless. He was retreating. As weeks passed, the house grew quieter. Grandpa stopped hosting family dinners. He stopped making plans beyond the immediate future. He spent more time alone. When I asked him if everything was all right, he smiled and said, "I don't want to cause trouble." That sentence haunted me. I began to realize that the pressure wasn't about the money anymore. The money had simply been the entry point. What followed was control, subtle, systematic, and wrapped in concern. Grandpa wasn't being yelled at. He wasn't being threatened. He was being managed. And in being managed, he was losing himself. The worst part was how easy it was for everyone else to pretend nothing was wrong. To accept my father's version of events because it was comfortable, because it required no confrontation, because it aligned with the image we had all grown up with: a responsible son, an aging father, a family handling things internally. Only I could see the cracks forming beneath that image. Only I noticed how Grandpa's voice softened when Dad was around, how his posture changed, how he deferred automatically, even when it cost him. I wanted to tell myself it would pass, that Grandpa would adjust, that this was just a transition. But deep down I knew something irreversible was happening. The pressure behind closed doors wasn't easing. It was tightening quietly, relentlessly, until the only option Grandpa could see was distance. And I was still standing there watching, saying nothing as the ground beneath our family continued to shift. The announcement came the way everything else had, quietly, without ceremony, as if it were a minor detail instead of a turning point. "I'm thinking of going to Florida," Grandpa said one afternoon, standing in his kitchen with a folded brochure in his hand. The ceiling fan hummed above us. Sunlight fell across the counter where he'd lined up his pills for the week. His voice was steady, but his eyes didn't meet mine. "For how long?" I asked. He shrugged. "I'll see." That was all he offered. No timeline, no explanation, just a direction. At first, the family treated it like a perfectly reasonable decision. "People do that," they said. "Retirees move south. Warmer weather. Better for the joints. Lower taxes, maybe." My father nodded approvingly when he heard. He even smiled. "Good for him," Dad said. "Fresh start." The words sounded supportive, but something about the way he said them made my stomach tighten. There was no surprise in his reaction, no concern, no questions about logistics or timing. It was as if this outcome had already been accounted for. Grandpa didn't sell his house right away. He packed slowly, deliberately, a few boxes at a time, clothes first, then books, then framed photos I'd grown up seeing on the walls. Every item he set aside felt like a quiet farewell. When I offered to help, he thanked me but said he wanted to do it himself. "I need to decide what I take," he said. Decide. The word sounded heavier than it should have. The day he left was unremarkable in a way that still feels wrong to me. No extended goodbyes, no family gathering, just a small suitcase, a duffel bag, and a rented car waiting in the driveway. My father shook his hand, told him to drive safe. I hugged him longer than usual, feeling the bones in his shoulders beneath my arms. "Call me when you get there," I said. "I will," he replied. He didn't. At first, I assumed he was busy settling in, finding his way around, getting used to a new place. Days passed, then weeks. When I called, the phone rang until voicemail. When I left messages, they went unanswered. I tried not to panic. I tried to respect his space. My father brushed off my concerns. "He's fine," Dad said. "He just needs time." But something about the silence didn't feel like adjustment. It felt like avoidance. When Grandpa finally did answer one of my calls weeks later, his voice sounded different. Thinner, more distant. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yes," he said quickly. "Everything's okay. Where are you staying?" I wanted to ask. "Are you safe? Are you happy? Do you want to come back?" Instead, I asked, "How's the weather?" "Warm," he said. "That's nice." The call lasted less than 5 minutes. I didn't know his address. No one did, apparently. When I asked my father, he said Grandpa was still figuring things out, that he'd let us know when he was settled. There was a finality in his tone that discouraged further questions. It was around that time that the distance began to feel intentional. Grandpa stopped responding to emails. His phone was often off. When he did pick up, his answers were brief, carefully neutral. He never complained, never expressed regret, but he also never sounded relaxed. "I don't want to bother anyone," he said once when I pressed gently. Bother anyone. That phrase echoed the same fear I'd heard months earlier, the same quiet surrender. Family life adjusted around his absence with unsettling ease. Holidays came and went. His chair remained empty, then gradually stopped being mentioned. My father filled the space effortlessly, hosting gatherings, directing conversations, acting as if nothing had changed. But things had changed. I felt it every time I passed Grandpa's house, now dark and empty. The porch where he used to drink his morning coffee collected dust. Mail piled up in the box until Dad arranged for it to be forwarded. Decisions were made without discussion. One afternoon, while helping my father sort through paperwork in his office, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. A folder labeled with Grandpa's name. Inside were copies of documents I recognized, bank statements, transfer confirmations forms I had seen on the kitchen table months earlier. The $250,000 transfer was there, clearly documented. Dates, account numbers, signatures. My father caught me looking. "Just keeping records organized," he said smoothly, taking the folder from my hands. "You know how important that is." I nodded, but my hands felt cold. That night I lay awake, replaying everything I had witnessed over the past year. The pressure, the silence, the move, the distance. It all lined up too neatly to be coincidence. Grandpa hadn't gone to Florida to relax. He had gone to disappear. The realization filled me with a kind of shame I didn't know how to name. I had been present for every step of it. I had seen the signs, and I had chosen comfort over confrontation every time. I tried harder to reach him after that. I called at different times of day. I sent letters to the last address I had, hoping they'd be forwarded. Weeks passed with no response. When he finally called me back, his voice was strained. "You don't need to worry," he said before I could even ask. "I am worried," I replied. There was a pause on the line. "I'm just trying to keep things simple," he said. Simple for whom I wanted to ask. Instead, I said, "I miss you." Another pause. Longer this time. "I know," he said quietly. That was when I understood something fundamental. Grandpa wasn't cutting ties because he didn't care. He was doing it because he believed distance was the only way to protect himself from conflict, from pressure, from being made to feel like he owed something he couldn't afford to give. Florida wasn't an escape. It was a boundary. And the fact that he felt the need to draw it that way told me everything I needed to know about what had been taken from him long before the money ever left his account. The silence that followed his departure wasn't empty. It was filled with fear, resignation, and the quiet cost of compliance. And it was only the beginning. After Grandpa left, time didn't move forward the way it used to. It stretched. Days blurred together, measured less by dates and more by unanswered calls and quiet realizations. The absence settled into my life slowly, like dust you don't notice until it coats everything. At first I tried to treat the silence as temporary. I told myself Grandpa needed space, that Florida was new, that he was adjusting. But weeks turned into months and the distance didn't close, it hardened. I called every Sunday evening at the same time. Sometimes the phone rang until it stopped. Sometimes it went straight to voicemail. When he did answer, the conversations felt rehearsed. He spoke politely, briefly, always reassuring me that he was fine, always steering the conversation away from anything specific. "How's your place?" I asked once. "It's adequate," he replied. Adequate. Not good. Not comfortable. Just enough. When I asked for his address so I could send him something, he hesitated. "I'll give it to you later," he said. He never did. I started writing letters instead, addressed simply to his old Ohio house, hoping they'd be forwarded. I didn't write anything emotional, nothing accusatory. Just updates, small things. The weather, work, memories I thought might make him feel connected. I never knew if he received them. My father noticed my efforts and subtly discouraged them. "You're worrying too much," he said one night when I mentioned I hadn't heard back. "He's an adult. Let him live his life." The words sounded reasonable, but they carried an edge. A warning. I began to understand that asking too many questions wasn't welcome. The family adjusted around Grandpa's absence with an efficiency that unsettled me. Holidays were restructured. Traditions were simplified. His name came up less and less. When it did, it was usually followed by a quick change of subject. It felt like erasure. I tried to hold on to what little contact I had. I learned to listen for what Grandpa didn't say. The pauses, the careful phrasing, the way he always reassured me before I could even express concern. "I don't want you caught in the middle," he said once. That sentence landed harder than anything else he'd said. Caught between whom, I wondered. And why did he assume that was inevitable? The more I thought about it, the clearer the pattern became. Grandpa wasn't just physically distant. He was withdrawing emotionally, deliberately limiting his presence so there would be nothing left to pressure, nothing left to take. I began to notice other things too, small details that didn't make sense on their own but together painted a troubling picture. His old bank account was closed. His mail was being redirected to a P.O. box, not a residential address. Medical appointments he used to tell me about stopped coming up in conversation. When I asked my father about these changes, he brushed them off. "He's simplifying," Dad said. "That's what people do at his age." At his age. The phrase felt dismissive, reducing Grandpa's choices to inevitability rather than response. One evening, while helping my father scan documents in his home office, I noticed something that made my heart race. A folder half open on his desk labeled simply H, Grandpa's initials. Inside were copies of financial statements, legal forms, and correspondence I recognized. I hadn't gone looking for them. They were just there in plain sight. I didn't say anything at first. I pretended not to notice. But later that night, the image of those papers wouldn't leave my mind. I replayed the moment Grandpa had signed the documents. The hesitation, the hovering pen, the look in his eyes. I realized then that silence hadn't just allowed things to happen. It had protected them. I started paying closer attention. I reviewed old emails. I searched through messages. I began piecing together a timeline not to accuse anyone but to understand what had actually occurred. Dates, transfers, conversations. Everything lined up too cleanly. The $250,000 transfer happened just weeks before Grandpa announced his move. The pressure intensified immediately afterward. His withdrawal followed shortly after. It wasn't coincidence. It was cause and effect. The weight of that realization was suffocating. I felt guilty for not acting sooner, angry at myself for choosing peace over protection. But beneath that guilt was something else, a growing resolve. I couldn't undo what had already happened, but I could stop pretending I didn't see it. The next time Grandpa called, I asked him directly, gently. "Are you okay where you are?" I asked. There was a long pause. "I'm safe," he said finally. "Safe. Not happy. Not settled. Just safe." "Do you want to come back?" I asked. Another pause. "I don't want to cause problems," he replied. That was his answer. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at nothing. The truth settled in slowly but firmly. Grandpa had left because staying meant constant pressure, because distance was the only leverage he had left. because silence to him felt safer than resistance, and I had helped create that silence. The realization didn't come with clarity or relief. It came with heaviness, with responsibility. For the first time, I understood that doing nothing had been a choice, and that choice had consequences. I didn't confront my father. Not yet. I wasn't ready. I knew that challenging him without preparation would lead nowhere. He thrived on confidence and control. Emotion wouldn't move him. Facts might. So I began collecting them quietly. I kept notes, dates, observations. I saved copies of messages. I wrote down every conversation I had with Grandpa, every phrase that hinted at fear or withdrawal. I didn't know where it would lead. I just knew I couldn't look away anymore. The silence after Grandpa's departure wasn't empty. It was full of meaning. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The distance between us had been created, deliberately shaped by pressure and justified by concern. And somewhere beneath all of it was a truth no one wanted spoken out loud. But silence, I was learning, doesn't erase truth. It only delays the moment when it has to be faced. The first real evidence didn't come from a dramatic discovery. It came from routine, one of those moments so ordinary it barely registers until you realize what it's given you. My company was auditing an internal process that quarter, and part of my job involved reviewing transaction logs and reconciling timelines. I spent hours every day matching dates to approvals, amounts to signatures. It trained my mind to notice patterns and, more importantly, inconsistencies. I didn't set out to apply that habit to my own family. It just happened. One evening, while organizing old emails on my personal laptop, I came across a forwarded message my father had sent me months earlier. At the time, I hadn't paid attention. It was a generic note about keeping everything documented attached to a PDF I'd never opened. I clicked it now more out of restlessness than intention. It was a confirmation notice from a financial institution. The date jumped out at me immediately. The transfer had been initiated 3 days before Grandpa signed the paperwork I remembered so clearly. 3 days before the pen hovered. 3 days before consent, at least on paper. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. Maybe I was misreading it. Maybe it was a preliminary hold, not a transfer. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. I needed context. I didn't confront my father. I didn't call the bank. I didn't even tell anyone what I'd found. Instead, I did what I'd always done best. I stayed quiet and looked deeper. Over the next few weeks, I reviewed everything I could access without crossing any legal or ethical lines. Old emails, calendar entries, text messages. I reconstructed conversations from memory, pairing them with dates and documents. Slowly, a clearer picture began to form. The pressure on Grandpa had escalated just after my father's business deal hit a delay. Not failed, delayed. A shortfall, a gap that needed to be bridged quickly to avoid penalties. That was when the temporary help conversation started. That was when urgency replaced explanation. I remembered my father's tone during that period. Calm but sharper. More insistent. Less patient with questions. I also remembered Grandpa's demeanor changing almost overnight. The more I lined things up, the less it looked like coincidence. The $250,000 wasn't requested because it was convenient. It was requested because it was necessary, and because Grandpa was the easiest source. One night, unable to sleep, I pulled out the folder where I'd started keeping notes. Dates, amounts, phrases that stuck with me. I added the new discovery and sat back staring at the ceiling. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about timing, about consent, about whether Grandpa had ever truly had a choice. I needed to hear his version again, this time with clarity. The next time he called, I didn't ease into the conversation. I didn't ask about the weather. I didn't pretend everything was fine. "Can I ask you something?" I said. There was a pause. "You can," he replied carefully. "When Dad talked to you about the money," I said, choosing my words slowly, "did you feel like you could say no?" The silence on the line stretched longer than I expected. I could hear his breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I felt like saying no would make things worse," he said. "For who?" I asked. "For everyone," he replied. "Mostly for me." I closed my eyes. "Did you understand all the paperwork before you signed it?" I asked. "I understood what your father explained," he said. "That's not what I asked," I said gently. Another pause. Longer this time. "No," he said. "Not really. That was it. That was the moment everything shifted." He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound bitter. He sounded tired, resigned, like someone admitting a truth he'd been carrying alone for too long. I didn't want trouble, he continued. Your father's very convincing. And I didn't want to lose what little peace I had left. I swallowed hard. Did you know the money was transferred before you signed? He inhaled sharply. No, he said. I didn't. The confirmation landed like a weight in my stomach. This wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't miscommunication. This was a line crossed quietly, confidently, and without resistance. I didn't tell Grandpa what I had found. Not yet. I didn't want to alarm him. I didn't want him to feel responsible for what came next. But I asked him something else instead. Do you still have copies of anything? I asked. Yes, he said. I kept what I could. Would you be willing to send them to me? I asked. Just to keep them safe. He hesitated. I don't want to start something, he said. I know, I replied. I'm not starting anything. I just want to understand. After a long pause, he agreed. The envelope arrived 2 weeks later, forwarded from a P.O. box. Inside were copies of documents I'd never seen. Older statements, handwritten notes, a timeline Grandpa had kept for himself. Dates circled. Amounts underlined. Small annotations in the margins written in careful, slightly shaky handwriting. He had been tracking everything all along. What struck me most wasn't the content. It was the fact that he'd felt the need to document his own experience privately, as if he didn't trust anyone else to hold the truth for him. I added his documents to my folder and continued cross-referencing. The inconsistencies multiplied. The timing, the order of events, the language used in emails versus what had been said out loud. It all pointed in the same direction. This hadn't been an equal transaction. It had been engineered. Still, I didn't act. Not yet. I knew better than to rush. My father was careful. He understood systems. He thrived in gray areas. Accusations without structure would only push him further into control. So I kept my silence, but it was different now. It wasn't avoidance. It was preparation. I stopped feeling guilty for waiting. I stopped blaming myself for not intervening sooner. What mattered was what I did next. The paper trail was no longer abstract. It was concrete. Dates, documents, evidence. And for the first time, I understood that justice wouldn't come from confrontation. It would come from clarity. Grandpa hadn't disappeared to Florida because he wanted to start over. He'd gone there because it was the only place he could breathe without pressure. The only place where he didn't feel watched, managed, or indebted. And now finally I had enough to make sure that distance wasn't the end of his story, but the beginning of the truth coming back into the light. The first time the truth threatened to surface, it wasn't because I forced it. It slipped through a crack my father didn't realize he'd left open. It happened at my cousin's engagement party, a polished, carefully staged event held at a private room in a downtown restaurant. White tablecloths, soft lighting, conversations designed to stay pleasant and shallow. My father moved through the room like he owned it, shaking hands, offering advice, congratulating people with the confidence of someone used to being admired. I stayed near the edges, observing, listening. Grandpa's absence was noticeable, though no one mentioned it directly. His empty chair sat near the end of the table untouched. Someone eventually filled the space with a purse, as if trying to make the gap less visible. I watched my father notice it, then deliberately look away. At some point in the evening, the conversation turned to finances. It always did when my father was around. Someone mentioned rising property values. Another asked for advice about refinancing. My father leaned in pleased, slipping easily into his familiar role. You just have to be decisive, he said. People hesitate too much. That's how opportunities pass them by. A few heads nodded. Someone laughed. And of course, he added casually, family support makes all the difference. The words were light, but they landed hard in my chest. A relative across the table smiled. Like how you helped your dad get things sorted out, she asked. My father didn't miss a beat. Exactly, he said. He didn't want to deal with the stress. I stepped in. Best decision for everyone. For a moment, the room felt too quiet. I watched faces shift, nothing dramatic, just subtle changes. Curiosity, mild discomfort. Someone asked, so is he enjoying Florida? Dad nodded. Very much. He needed space, less responsibility. I could hear Grandpa's voice in my head. I don't want to cause trouble. I didn't speak. I didn't contradict him. I simply watched as my father's version of events was accepted without challenge. It was familiar, practiced clean, and it left no room for the truth. Later that evening, as people stood and mingled, a woman approached me quietly. She was a friend of the family, a retired accountant who had known my grandparents for years. "I didn't realize your grandfather had moved permanently," she said. "He didn't either," I almost replied. I stopped myself just in time. "He's in Florida for now," I said instead. She studied my face for a moment. "He was always careful," she said. "With money, with everything." I nodded. "Careful people don't usually disappear," she added softly. That was the first time someone else said it out loud. After that night, the cracks widened. My father began referencing Grandpa less, but when he did, his language sharpened. He spoke about responsibility, about efficiency, about how some people needed guidance whether they admitted it or not. The words were still polite, but there was a defensiveness beneath them I hadn't noticed before. Meanwhile, I continued gathering information quietly. I reached out to a financial advisor, not to accuse but to ask general questions. Hypotheticals. What constituted informed consent? What timelines mattered? What red flags professionals were trained to notice? Each answer reinforced what I already knew. I also contacted a legal aid office in Florida again, framing everything as a general inquiry. They explained elder financial exploitation in careful, measured terms. No dramatics. Just definitions, criteria, and procedures. When I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking. This wasn't about interpretation anymore. It was about whether the facts would be acknowledged. The next time I spoke to Grandpa, I told him what I was doing, not everything, but enough. "I'm asking questions," I said, "just to understand what happened." He was quiet for a long time. "I don't want you fighting with your father because of me," he finally said. "I'm not fighting," I replied. "I'm listening." That seemed to matter to him. "I trusted him," Grandpa said. "I still do. I just didn't feel free. Free. The word felt fragile, like something that could break if mishandled. As the weeks passed, my father sensed the shift. He didn't know what I knew, but he knew something had changed. He started asking questions, small ones at first. What I'd been working on, who I'd talked to, whether Grandpa had mentioned anything. I answered honestly but minimally. "He sounds fine," I said. "Quiet." Dad nodded. "That's how he's always been." But his confidence had dulled. He began justifying things no one had questioned, explaining decisions that had never been debated. It was subtle, but it was there. The real turning point came during a routine bank review my father attended, as part of his business. An internal compliance officer flagged something, an inconsistency in documentation timing tied to a family-linked account. It wasn't an accusation, just a request for clarification. My father mentioned it to me that evening, irritated. "Banks are getting ridiculous," he said. "They want explanations for everything." "What did they ask?" I said carefully. He hesitated. "Just procedural stuff." I nodded, saying nothing. But inside, I felt the shift fully take place. The truth was no longer hidden in my folder or my notes. It had entered a system that didn't care about family dynamics or intent. A system that cared only about timelines and consent. I didn't celebrate that. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt heavy. That night, I wrote a long email to myself documenting everything I knew so far. Dates, conversations, documents. I didn't send it. I saved it. I wanted a record that couldn't be rewritten. Public cracks had formed. Not wide enough to expose everything, but wide enough to let light in, and once light enters, control becomes harder to maintain. My father wasn't confronted. Not yet. Grandpa wasn't summoned. Not yet. Nothing dramatic happened. No voices were raised. No accusations made. But the narrative my father had built, the clean, confident version of events, had begun to unravel. Quietly, methodically, in front of people who had no emotional investment in protecting it. The truth hadn't arrived with force. It arrived with questions. Florida was not what I imagined it would be. I had pictured palm trees and ocean air, a place of rest and relief. What I found instead was quiet that felt provisional, as if it could be taken away at any moment. I didn't tell my father I was going. I told him I had a work conference out of state, and left it at that. The decision to visit Grandpa had come after weeks of careful thought, after enough evidence had accumulated that I could no longer justify distance. I booked a flight, rented a car, and drove inland from the airport, away from tourist areas and postcard scenery. Grandpa was staying in a small, single-story rental on the edge of a retirement community. No decorations, no photos on the walls, just the basics. It looked less like a home and more like a place someone stayed while waiting for something else to happen. When he opened the door and saw me, his expression shifted through surprise, concern, and something close to relief. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I wanted to," I replied. He stepped aside and let me in. Inside, everything was orderly but impersonal. A rented couch, a small table, a lamp positioned precisely as if measured. He offered me water, not coffee. He said he hadn't unpacked the coffee maker yet. We sat across from each other, the air between us heavy with things neither of us had said out loud. "I didn't want you worrying," he said finally. "I've been worried anyway," I replied. He nodded as if that made sense. I didn't start with the money. I didn't mention documents or timelines. I asked him how he was sleeping, how his knee was doing, whether the heat helped. He answered politely, carefully, like someone who had learned to stay within safe topics. Eventually, I asked the question that had brought me there. "Why Florida?" I said. He looked down at his hands. They were folded neatly, just like they always were. "It was quiet," he said. "Far enough." From what I asked gently, he didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "From pressure," he said. The word hung in the room. He told me then, not all at once, but slowly in pieces. About the conversations with my father that went on longer than he was comfortable with. About how every hesitation was met with reassurance that felt more like correction. About how saying no seemed to create tension he didn't have the energy to manage. "I didn't feel like I could refuse without being difficult," he said. "And I didn't want to be difficult." "Did you feel threatened?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, not like that. It was persistent, calm, reasonable. That's what made it hard." He described how the paperwork was presented after days of discussion when he was already worn down. How he'd been told everything was standard, that lawyers had reviewed it, that there was no real risk. "I trusted him," he said. "He's my son." That sentence carried decades of history, of authority, of expectation. I asked him about the timing, about whether he'd known the money had already been transferred. "No," he said immediately. "If I had known that, I wouldn't have signed." His certainty startled me. "Why didn't you say anything afterward?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Because by then it felt done," he said. "And because I didn't want to fight, I couldn't win." That was the moment I understood. Florida wasn't a choice, it was a retreat. He hadn't come here to relax. He had come here to regain control in the only way he knew how, by removing himself from the situation entirely. "I thought distance would make it stop," he said. "Did it?" I asked. He hesitated. "Some. Not enough," I thought. Not if he still sounded like this. I told him then about what I had found. Not every detail, but enough to be honest. About the timing discrepancy. About the documents. About the questions being asked by people outside the family. I watched his face carefully as I spoke. There was no shock, no outrage, just a slow, sad recognition. "I wondered," he said quietly. "I just didn't want to be right." I asked him if he felt taken advantage of. He considered the question for a long time. "I feel like I was managed," he said. "Like my choices were narrowed until there was only one left." That distinction mattered. He wasn't accusing. He was describing. "I don't want him punished," he added quickly. "I just want to be left alone." "I know," I said. "But you shouldn't have had to disappear to get that." We sat in silence after that, the air heavy but clear. For the first time since this had begun, nothing felt hidden between us. Before I left, he handed me a folder thicker than the one he'd mailed. Inside were additional notes, copies of correspondence, and something else I hadn't expected. A handwritten letter he'd drafted but never sent. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It simply explained his perspective in his own words. Calm, measured, clear. "I wrote it in case I needed it," he said. "I didn't think I would." I took the folder and promised him I wouldn't do anything without talking to him first. "Whatever happens," I said, "you won't be alone in it." He nodded, his eyes damp but steady. When I left Florida, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. The truth wasn't abstract anymore. It had a voice, a place, a reason. Grandpa hadn't disappeared because he was weak. He had disappeared because he was overwhelmed and because the system around him had made compliance easier than resistance. As I boarded the plane home, I knew the next steps would be public, involving people who didn't care about family roles or intentions. People who dealt in evidence, timelines, and responsibility. I didn't know how my father would respond when the full truth came into the open. But I knew one thing for certain. This story wouldn't end in Florida. The moment authority entered the story, everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a precision that made avoidance impossible. It began with a letter, not a threatening one, not even an accusatory one. Just a formal notice requesting clarification regarding a financial transfer connected to an elderly account holder now residing out of state. Neutral language, clear deadlines, a list of documents requested, the kind of letter designed to gather facts, not emotions. My father received his copy the same week I returned from Florida. He didn't mention it right away. When he finally did, it was over dinner in the same measured tone he used when discussing business setbacks. "Someone's asking questions about your grandfather's accounts," he said, as if it were a minor inconvenience. "Routine stuff." I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of questions? Timing?" "Consent. Documentation," he replied. "Banks are cautious these days." I nodded. "That makes sense." He studied me for a moment as if searching for something in my reaction. When he found nothing, he looked away. What he didn't know was that the same institution had contacted Grandpa directly through a legal aid clinic in Florida that specialized in elder financial protections. They weren't aggressive. They were careful. They asked him to describe events in his own words. They asked him whether he'd felt pressured. They asked him whether he understood the transaction at the time it occurred. Grandpa answered honestly. I was present for that call, sitting quietly beside him as he spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply described what had happened in the same calm, factual way he'd described everything his whole life. "I didn't feel I could refuse," he said. "I didn't feel informed. I didn't feel free." Those words carried more weight than any allegation could have. Within days, the process widened. A compliance officer requested additional records. A financial review was opened. Not a criminal investigation, not yet, but a formal inquiry that required explanations backed by evidence, not confidence. My father reacted the way he always did when challenged. He doubled down on composure. "This is getting blown out of proportion," he said when I saw him next. "People don't understand family dynamics. But systems don't care about dynamics. They care about documentation." He began assembling his defense-organized binders, emails, printed and highlighted notes outlining his intent. He spoke often about how much he'd done for Grandpa, how he'd meant to help, how there was no malicious intent. Intent, however, was no longer the focus. The focus was timing. The focus was consent. The focus was whether an elderly individual had been placed under undue influence to transfer a significant portion of his assets without full understanding. My father was asked to explain why the transfer had been initiated before paperwork was signed. He was asked to explain why Grandpa's access to certain accounts had been limited afterward. He was asked to explain why communication records showed a sudden withdrawal following the transaction. Each question was polite, each one precise, and each one removed a layer of control he had relied on. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse him. I didn't need to. The facts were doing that work for me. At one point, a mediator suggested a formal meeting, a neutral setting where all parties could clarify their understanding. Grandpa was hesitant. He didn't want confrontation. He didn't want conflict. "You don't have to argue," the mediator said gently. "You just have to answer." The meeting was scheduled at a regional office, a public building with glass walls and neutral colors, not intimidating but unmistakably official. A place where voices stayed calm and records mattered. My father arrived confident, carrying his binders. Grandpa arrived quietly, leaning on his cane, his posture straight despite everything. I sat beside him not as a spokesperson but as support. The mediator began by outlining the process. Then she asked Grandpa to speak. He did. He described the conversations, the pressure, the sense that saying no wasn't an option. He explained why he'd left Ohio, why Florida felt safer. My father listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When it was his turn, he spoke about responsibility, about protecting assets, about making decisions others weren't equipped to make. The mediator listened carefully, then asked one simple question. "Did you believe your father had the freedom to decline?" My father hesitated. "That wasn't the intention," he said finally. It wasn't an answer. By the end of the meeting, no conclusions were announced, no judgments passed. But something had shifted irrevocably. The authority in the room wasn't swayed by tone or intention. It was anchored in evidence. A formal recommendation followed weeks later. The transfer was deemed improperly executed. The consent was deemed insufficiently informed. The influence was deemed undue. The $250,000 would be returned to Grandpa's account, with safeguards put in place to ensure independent oversight going forward. There were no handcuffs, no courtroom drama, no raised voices, just a written determination that stated plainly and publicly that what had happened was not acceptable. My father didn't argue after that. He couldn't. The process had stripped the situation down to facts, and facts don't bend to authority. When the funds were restored, Grandpa didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He simply sat quietly, his hands resting on the table as if something heavy had finally been set down. "I didn't want this to be a fight," he said to me later. "It wasn't," I replied. "It was clarity." My father withdrew after that, not in anger but in silence, the kind that comes when confidence has been exposed, not destroyed but limited. What mattered most wasn't the money. It was that Grandpa no longer had to disappear to protect himself. The authority that had stepped in hadn't shouted. It hadn't accused. It had simply asked the right questions in the right order, until the truth had nowhere left to hide. And for the first time since this began, justice didn't feel delayed anymore. It felt present. The reckoning didn't arrive with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It arrived the way real accountability often does, quietly in a room where no one could hide behind familiarity. The follow-up hearing was scheduled on a weekday morning at the same regional office. This time it wasn't framed as a mediation. It was a formal review open to the record with a compliance panel present. The glass walls made everything feel exposed. Anyone walking past could see us seated at the table, my father on one side, Grandpa and me on the other, folders laid out in careful order. My father arrived early. He always did. His suit was pressed, his posture straight, his expression composed. If someone had walked in without context, they might have assumed he was the professional in charge. Grandpa arrived quietly a few minutes later. He wore a simple jacket, the one he always wore when he wanted to look respectable without drawing attention. He leaned on his cane, but his steps were steady. When he sat down, he placed his hands flat on the table, grounding himself. I sat beside him, close enough that he could feel my presence without me saying a word. The panel opened by summarizing their findings. Not opinions, findings. Dates, amounts, and procedural failures read aloud in a calm, neutral voice. Each point was backed by documentation, bank logs, email timestamps, recorded statements. As the words filled the room, I watched my father carefully. For the first time, he wasn't controlling the narrative. The panel acknowledged intent, but they didn't center it. They focused instead on outcome, on power imbalance, on the responsibility that comes with proximity and trust. Then they asked Grandpa to speak again. He did just as he had before, calm, measured. He didn't accuse his son. He didn't recount every slight or moment of discomfort. He spoke only to how it felt to be in those conversations, how each reassurance narrowed his options, how refusing seemed like choosing conflict over peace. "I didn't feel like I had room to decide," he said. "I felt like the decision was being made around me." There was no tremor in his voice, no anger, just clarity. When my father was invited to respond, he took a breath before speaking. His confidence was still there, but it was restrained now, held in check by the room. "I was trying to help," he said. "I didn't think." The panel chair raised a hand gently. "We understand that perspective," she said, "but intent does not override process." My father nodded slowly, as if absorbing the words for the first time. Then came the part that changed everything. The panel asked him directly and publicly whether he recognized that his position of authority within the family may have influenced his father's ability to consent freely. The room went still. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked down at his hands. For a moment the polished image slipped, not enough to reveal remorse, but enough to reveal limitation. "I can see that now," he said quietly. It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. The panel concluded by reaffirming their determination the funds had already been returned, safeguards implemented, and independent oversight assigned. Grandpa's finances would no longer be managed by any family member. Any future decisions would involve a neutral third party. The meeting ended without drama. No one clapped, no one argued. The panel thanked us and stood. The room emptied slowly, the way it always does after something irreversible has been stated out loud. Outside in the hallway, my father stopped. "I never meant to hurt him," he said, not looking at either of us. Grandpa didn't respond. I felt a familiar urge to fill the silence, to soften the moment, to make things easier. But I didn't. I had learned by then that silence when chosen intentionally can be powerful. After a moment, my father nodded once and walked away. We didn't watch him leave. Grandpa exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he'd been holding for years. "It's over," he said. "Yes," I replied. "It is." We sat together for a while in the lobby before leaving. He didn't rush. He didn't look over his shoulder. For the first time since Florida, he looked unburdened, not happy exactly, but steady. Later that afternoon, we went to a quiet cafe nearby. Grandpa ordered soup and tea. He ate slowly, thoughtfully, as if relearning how to take up time. "I didn't want him embarrassed," he said at one point. "He wasn't," I replied. "He was held accountable." There's a difference. One shames, the other clarifies. That evening when we returned to my place, Grandpa sat by the window and watched the streetlights come on. He told me he was ready to come back from Florida, not immediately but soon, on his terms. "I want a place where I don't feel managed," he said. "You will," I told him. Word spread quietly through the family. Not gossip, just fact. The money had been returned. The matter resolved. My father didn't offer his version. He didn't need to. The record spoke for itself. Some relatives reached out. A few apologized for not noticing sooner. Others stayed silent. I didn't expect anything from them. This wasn't about validation. It was about restoration. Grandpa no longer had to explain himself. He no longer had to disappear to be safe. He could exist fully again without pressure disguised as care. As for me, something fundamental shifted. I realized that strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, gathers facts, and steps forward only when it can no longer be ignored. The public reckoning wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was precise. And in that precision, justice finally stood where it belonged, in the open, undeniable, and calm. The weeks after the hearing felt unfamiliar in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just quieter, cleaner somehow, as if a low, constant hum had finally been switched off. Grandpa stayed with me for a while after returning from Florida. He didn't rush to reclaim his old house. He said he wanted time to decide what felt right now, that he wasn't deciding out of necessity. Mornings became slow again. Coffee at the table. The newspaper folded neatly, not rushed through. He moved through my apartment carefully at first like a guest, then gradually with more ease. What struck me most was how his posture changed. He stood straighter. He took longer pauses before answering questions, not from hesitation, but from choice. Silence no longer looked like retreat. It looked like rest. My father kept his distance. There were no angry messages, no attempts to reframe what had happened. He sent one text a few weeks later asking how Grandpa was doing. I replied honestly, "He's okay. Nothing more. Nothing less." My father didn't respond. I thought that silence would bother me. Instead, it felt appropriate. The family adjusted slowly and unevenly. Some relatives acted as if nothing had happened. Others acknowledged it with awkward kindness. No one argued the outcome. There was nothing to argue with. The facts were public. The record was clear. Grandpa didn't speak badly about my father. He never had. When someone asked him how he felt, he said, "I feel lighter." That was all. One afternoon, we drove past his old house. The lawn was overgrown. The porch needed repair. He looked at it for a long moment. "I don't think I'll go back there," he said. "Do you want to sell it?" I asked. "Not yet," he replied. "I want to decide without pressure." That word again. Pressure. This time it didn't hang heavy. It felt acknowledged, named, understood, released. I realized then how much of my own life I had lived under similar, quieter pressures. Expectations I never questioned. Roles I accepted without asking whether they fit. Watching Grandpa reclaim his autonomy made me confront how easily I had surrendered my own voice over the years. I had believed that staying silent kept the peace. What it really did was delay the truth. Grandpa eventually found a small apartment closer to me. Nothing fancy, just a place with light in the mornings and a park nearby where he could walk without feeling watched. He chose it himself, signed the lease himself, asked questions, took his time. The first night he spent there, he called me. "I slept well," he said. That sentence mattered more than anything else he could have told me. As for the money, it returned to being what it always should have been, a tool, not a weapon. Managed independently. Protected. No longer a lever for control. Grandpa didn't talk about it much. He didn't need to. The safety mattered more than the sum. My relationship with my father changed permanently, not dramatically, just fundamentally. I no longer deferred. I no longer assumed. When we spoke, which wasn't often, I listened without yielding. I answered without explaining myself. He noticed. I could tell. Once months later, he said, "You handled things your way." "Yes," I replied. "I did." That was the closest we came to acknowledgement. There was no moment of reconciliation, no tearful apology, and I didn't need one. Justice doesn't always repair relationships. Sometimes it simply redraws boundaries so no one gets hurt again. The most unexpected change was internal. I stopped questioning whether I had done the right thing. The doubt that once followed every decision had quieted. Not because everything had turned out perfectly, but because I had finally acted in alignment with the truth I saw. Grandpa didn't have to disappear anymore. He hadn't been weak. He had been patient in a system that rewarded confidence over care. When the right questions were asked by the right people in the right order, the truth didn't need defending. It stood on its own. I used to think justice was loud, confrontational, public in a dramatic way. Now I know better. Sometimes justice looks like an elderly man choosing his own apartment, like money returned without fanfare, like authority figures speaking calmly and refusing to be impressed by confidence, like silence being used not to hide but to hold. Most of all, justice looked like Grandpa sitting at my kitchen table one morning, sunlight on his hands, saying, "I feel like myself again." That was the moment I knew everything that had been delayed had finally arrived. Not with punishment, not with shouting, but with dignity restored. It's this silence can look like peace, but it often hides imbalance. For a long time, everyone believed my grandfather was fine because he wasn't complaining, because he wasn't arguing, because he chose distance instead of conflict. But quiet endurance is not consent, and calm compliance is not the same as freedom. Sometimes the people who suffer the most are the ones who have learned that speaking up feels more dangerous than staying silent. Real justice doesn't always arrive with shouting or punishment. Sometimes it arrives when someone finally asks the right questions and listens, without rushing to explain things away. Sometimes it arrives when truth is allowed to stand on its own, without being softened to protect someone else's comfort. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this: pay attention to who is always understanding, always fine, always the one who steps back. Their silence might be carrying more weight than you realize. And if you've ever been that person enduring quietly choosing peace over your own voice, I hope this story reminds you that your boundaries matter. You don't have to disappear to deserve safety. You don't have to give up control to keep the family together. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever stayed silent to keep the peace, and what did it cost you? Please share your thoughts in the comments along with your location and local time. I read every message. And if stories about quiet strength, delayed justice, and dignity restored resonate with you, consider subscribing to this channel. These stories exist, so no one has to feel alone in their silence.